Now let's take a close look at the KDFX Studio. Press the Effects Mode button. As we saw previously, you can call up a studio from within a program or a setup, but it's also possible to select a studio on the main effects page. Let's take a minute to define what a studio is. There's a very good reason we have called this object a studio, and that is because it really follows the concept of a recording studio environment. For those of you who have experience in working in a recording studio, you'll find the following to be familiar. Imagine that you have a mixing board with 4 stereo input channels, or they can be even configured as 8 mono inputs, or a combination in between. For each channel input, you have 2 EQs. For each channel, you also have 2 effect sends. Now, over in a rack on the side, you have 4 stereo effect processors, plus an additional effects processor that can be used as a global effects processor. Finally, you have an audio patch bay that lets you route a signal from anywhere in the chain to any specific output jack. As you can see from looking at this graphic, editing a studio allows you to choose how you want to route a signal. Set EQ and effects and send it to a specific output. Now, take a look at the display of the 2600. The first 2 parameters are effects mode and effects channel. These parameters are important to understand because they determine how the studio is controlled. Remember that even though you can have multiple effects, they are accessed from a studio, and only a single studio can be active at one time. So you use the effects mode parameter to choose what will control the studio. The default value is auto. This means that whichever mode you're currently in is controlling the effects. Each program and setup has a studio assigned to it. So if you go to program mode and call up a program, the studio assigned to the program on the KDFX page in the program editor will be called up. For example, if we go to program mode, call up number 1, and then go back to effects mode, you'll see that the studio number is 49. If you go back to program mode, call up number 20, and then go back to the effects. You'll see number 181. The same would apply for setups. The effects mode parameter works in conjunction with the effects channel. The default value for this is current. This means that the program assigned to the MIDI channel currently in the display is in control of the effects. But you can also set this to a specific channel. For example, you could set it so that the program on channel 1 is in control of the studio. As we mentioned, in auto, either a program or a setup can be in control, depending on which mode you're in. You can also set this parameter to setup or program only. The final value is master. When set to master, the studio that you call up on this page will be the one that you hear, no matter what program you call up. In this situation, the effects channel parameter is meaningless. For practical purposes, you'll normally want to leave effects mode set to auto and effects channel set to current. That way, no matter where you are in the instrument, you'll hear the studio associated with what you're looking at. The only exception to this is when you're sequencing and using an external sequencer instead of the Kurzweil's own song mode. In this case, you should set effects mode to program and effects channel to a specific MIDI channel. We'll cover this example more thoroughly later in the video. Since you will most typically be controlling a studio from a program or setup, we'll explore the studio from within a program. Go to program mode and call up program 199, the default program. Now press Edit to enter the program editor, then press the Write More button 6 times. Now, press the KDFX button. Now, let's add an effect to the program. The first parameter on the screen is the studio. A studio is a single object which consists of multiple effects and EQs, plus signal and output routing. We'll be going into great detail in the studio, but first, I want to review an easy way to try different effects from the preset studios. Select studio number 1, then take a look at the name. The 2600 has 4 separate effect buses, plus a global auxiliary effect. As mentioned previously, when covering setups, we have named our preset studios so that you can tell what the various effects are in the studio. In this studio, there is a room reverb on effects bus 1, a chorus on effect bus 2, and the delay on effect bus 3. Effects bus 4 has no effects assigned to it, which is indicated by the space between delay and hall. In all of our preset studios, we have left effects bus 4 set to no effect, so that you always have one dry bus to choose from if you need it. Finally, a hall reverb is assigned as the auxiliary effect. Now, press the left More button 3 times, and then press the Output Soft button. As we did when we edited the setup, if you switch the output setting, you can choose which effect in the current studio that will be used for this layer in the program. Notice the pair parameter is set to KDFX A. One thing that you should understand is that the output pair parameter on this page does not refer to the actual output jacks on the back of the instrument. Instead, it refers to an output which sends the signal out of the synthesizer part of the 2600 and into the effects part of the 2600. All of our preset studios are designed to be as easy to use as possible, so we always have KDFX A going to effects bus 1, KDFX B going to effects bus 2, and so on. Remember that in our studio we had a reverb, a chorus, and a delay. Since our layer is now set to KDFX A, you will hear that room reverb when you play the instrument. Now, switch it to B. When you play, you'll hear a chorus. If we switch it to C, we'll hear a delay. We have not yet heard the auxiliary hall reverb because it's not connected within the studio. But as you can see, it's very easy to try out different effects by picking a studio and then switching layers in the program to various outputs. Now, put the output back to KDFX-A. Now press the right More button 3 times, and then the KDFX button. Select Studio 199, the default studio, and press Edit. You're now in the Studio Editor on the Effects Bus page. We'll explore the studio in the order that the signal flows through it. So press the Input button, and we'll start at the beginning of the studio. The display shows the first part of the signal path of the studio. Notice that in the upper right-hand corner, it says Input A. And there's also an A at the beginning of the signal path. This A corresponds with the output setting of KDFX-A that is chosen in the program editor. Remember previously in this video, we were editing a program, and we were able to switch effects by changing the output to A, B, C, or D. What we were actually doing was changing which input we were using going into the studio. To switch inputs, you use the channel bank buttons to the left of the display. Make sure that you have the input set to A and play your keyboard. Notice that the arrow leading from the A to the first EQ flickers. This gives you a visual monitor of when a signal is coming in from that input. If you switch to input B and play, you'll see that the arrow doesn't flicker, showing you that this program has its layers routed to A. This can be very useful if you're playing a program or setup which is using multiple input buses for the different layers of programs, helping you to keep track of where everything is being routed. In the upper left-hand corner of the display, the currently highlighted parameter says SP. This means that this input is set for stereo with panning. You can change it to stereo with balance or to mono. For info on these settings, you should consult your manual. We'll leave it set to stereo with pan. Now, let's look at the signal path itself. The first 2 boxes are the 2 EQs that we talked about before. By highlighting a box, you can choose from several different types of EQ for each of the 2 EQ segments. The Kurzweil offers low and high shelving EQ, a fixed width parameter EQ, a low and high pass filtering. If you have chosen a shelf or a parametric EQ, then you'll see 2 parameters below it. The G is a gain parameter, and the F is the frequency. For example, if I set the high shelf frequency to 880 Hertz, then I can boost or cut the frequencies above 880 Hertz by changing the gain. If gain is left at 0 dB, then in essence you have no EQ, since you are not boosting or cutting any frequencies. If you choose a low pass or high pass, then you will only see a frequency parameter. Any frequencies above or below that parameter, depending on whether you choose low pass or high pass, are cut off. After passing through the two EQs, you can see that the signal is split and sent to two different effects buses. Remember when I described the basic concept of a studio? I said each channel on our pretend mixing board had two effect sends, and that there were 4 separate effects processors in our pretend rack. These are called effects buses in the Kurzweil. By highlighting these boxes, you can choose which effect buses each input will be routed to. In this case, we see input A is routed to effects bus 1 and effects bus 2. Below each effects bus is a level parameter. This allows you to control how much signal is sent into that effect. The level under the first box is set at 0 dB, which means the signal passes into the effect without any changes. Notice that the level under the second box is set to off. So even though it's possible to send the input to both effect buses, in this case, input A is only being sent to effects bus 1. Now, let's scroll through the inputs with the channel bank buttons and look at the bus assignments. You will see that the level of the second box is set to off, or the effects bus is set to none for all 4 of the inputs. And if you look at the first box, you'll see that input A goes to effects bus 1. Input B goes to effects bus 2. C goes to 3, and D goes to 4. To make things consistent, this is the way we have programmed all of the preset studios. Of course, you can program the routing any way that you need, but we have stuck with this simple system in the presets to make things as easy as possible for you. As you start switching through the different preset studios, you can always depend on the routing to follow this simple scheme. Now, press the Effects Bus Soft button. This is where you actually choose the effect that you want for each bus. The display tells you which bus you're looking at in the upper right-hand corner, as well as the left side of the signal flow diagram. Once again, you use the channel bank buttons to switch between the buses. Let's assign effects preset 1, nice little booth, to effects bus 1. Again, if you play the keyboard, you'll see that the arrow leading into the effects preset blinks, indicating that the signal is going into the effect. Notice that on the top line, it now says size 1 and free 3. These refer to what we call processing allocation units, or PAUs. Each effect algorithm requires a specific amount of processing power. The more complicated effects require more power and therefore take up more PAUs. There are a total of 4 PAUs that can be split among the 4 effects buses, plus 3 PAUs for the global auxiliary effect. So this means that if you pick an effect which uses more than 1 PAU, at least one of your other effect buses won't be able to have an effect on it. The top line of the display shows you how many PAUs a specific effect uses and how many are left unused after totaling the effects from all 4 buses. Press the Channel Up button to go to Effect Bus 2 and select Effects Preset 135, 8-tap delay. The display shows you this effect uses 2 PAUs. Since we're already using 1 PAU for Effects Bus 1, there's only 1 PAU left, so free is set to 1. Now scroll to Effects Bus 3 and select Effects Preset 176. This uses our last PAU, so now free is set to 0. If you change the effect preset to 177, you'll notice it's in parentheses. This is because this effect uses 2 PAUs, but there's only 1 free. So this effect would not be used, and no effect is called up on this bus. Now, scroll back to Effects Bus 2 and play the keyboard. Notice that you're still hearing the reverb effect, not a delay. And the arrow does not even blink. This is because input B leads into effects bus 2, but our program has its output assigned to input A of KDFX. This demonstrates that it's easy to be hearing one thing and looking at something else, based on how you have your signal routed. That is why the blinking arrow is very useful. Now, go back to effects bus 1, and we'll look at the rest of the signal path. After going through the effect, the signal can then be sent to an auxiliary effect, or directly to the mix, or both of them. It can also be sent directly to an output, which we will discuss in a moment. Just as we saw on the input page, there are level settings for both aux and mix, allowing you to increase or decrease the signal before sending it into that area. Right now, aux level is off, so that no signal is going to the aux effect, and everything goes to the mix. It is also possible to send all of the signal to the aux and set the mix to off. Let's set the level for the aux to 0 dB. I'll press 0 and enter, and leave the mix also at 0 dB. Now, press the aux button. This is where you select the effects preset that is used as the aux effect. Let's call up effects preset 61, Semi-Sweet Hall. One thing to remember about the aux effect is that it is a single global effect. So if you have more than one effects bus set to go into the aux effect, they will all get the same effect added. But since you can set the level of the signal for each effects bus, you can choose how much signal from that bus is sent into the aux effect. Now, play your keyboard. Notice that the arrow once again blinks, showing you signal is coming into the aux effect. You should also notice that your signal is louder now. It is actually twice as loud. Let's look at why this happens. Notice that the signal coming out of the aux effect is going into the mix with the level set at 0 dB. Now, go back to the effects bus page and look at the signal path. You can see that the signal is split when it comes out of the effects bus and sent equally to the aux and the mix. But on the aux page, we also had the signal going back into the mix. So the mix is getting two signals coming into it, one directly from the effects bus with the booth reverb, and also from the aux effect, which includes both the booth and hall reverbs. In other words, it gets twice as much signal, so it's twice as loud. If you want to bring the signal back down, there are several approaches you could take. One way would be to set the level going from the effects bus to the mix to off. This way, the whole signal goes directly through the booth, and then into the hall, and then to the mix. Or, you can lower one or more of the level parameters on this page and the aux page. Obviously, depending on where you choose to lower the level, that will determine on how much reverb you hear in relation to the overall signal. The final way you can lower the level is to bring down the mix level on the output page, which we'll look at next. As you can see, you have a great deal of control over your signal as it passes through various stages in the studio. As you become more familiar with KDFX, we encourage you to experiment with various approaches to signal routing and see what types of end results that you can get. Now, press the output button. This is the final stage of the studio. This is where you determine what you hear coming out of the specific physical out jacks on the 2600. This page also allows you to control the level of the mix. In our current example, we doubled the signal level by having the signal going both to the mix and aux, and feeding the aux back into the mix, with everything set at 0 dB. To bring the signal back to its original level, we can set the mix level to -3 dB. Now let's look at the output parameters. These outputs correspond to actual pairs of jacks on the 2600. We see that output A is set to mix, and all other outputs are set to off. So all the signals are going to be coming out of the A separate outs or out of the mix outs, and nothing will come out of the other separate outs. We have programmed all of the preset studios in this manner. So if you have the ability to run multiple outputs into your system, you will need to edit the studios for this. Let's look at the various possible values for the outputs. The first possible value is off. which is obviously no output. Next, we see pre-effect 1. This will give you all signals sent to effects bus 1 previous to its running through the effect, but after the EQs and any pan or balance adjustments. Remember that it is possible to assign more than one input to an effects bus, so you could have several signals mixed together. But as we mentioned before, all of our preset studios have each input sent to a different effects bus. So in the case of our preset studios, this will always be the signals coming from input A. Next, we see effects bus 1. As you would expect, this is the signal after it has run through the effect on that bus. Again, it could have signals coming from multiple inputs, but in our preset studios, this will be the signal sent to input A. Next, we have pre-effects and effects bus settings for the other three buses. After that, we have aux effect. This will give you the output of the aux effects bus. Remember that in order to hear a signal with this setting, you would need to send the signal from an effects bus into the aux effects by setting the level to something other than off. Finally, we have mix. Let's talk for a moment about the mix output jacks versus the mix setting on the output page. These are two separate things, but since they're named the same, this can be confusing. Remember that I mentioned at the beginning of the video that all signals will come out of the mix output jacks. This is hardwired into the instrument and requires no programming. In general, you'll probably find it easiest to plug cables into the separate outs using just the A outs if you have only room for two inputs in your mixing board. So, when would you want to use the mix outs? Let's say that you use your 2600 in both a studio and live setting. In this studio, you want to use multiple outputs, and so you edit your studios to route the signals to the different outs. But when you perform live, you might want to keep things as simple as possible and use only two outputs. Instead of having to go back and reprogram all of your studios, you can simply plug into the mix outs, and everything will come out of those two outputs. Go back to the mix value on the output page. This mix has to do with the mixing of the signals from the various effect buses in the studio. Typically, this might be a mix of all four effects buses, but it doesn't have to be. Remember that on the effects bus and the aux effects page, you can determine whether or not the signal is sent into the mix. So you might choose to mix two different effects buses together and send that to one output pair while sending the other effects buses directly to other outputs. As you can see, there are many possibilities for how you might choose to route signals to your output jacks. One way might be to set output A to effects bus 1, output B to effects bus 2, and so forth. But if no output is set to the aux effects or mix, you could never hear the aux effect. Or you could set one of your outputs to aux or mix and set the others to separate effects buses, and then send only certain buses into the aux effect. The best thing is that since this is all programmable per studio, you can make different studios for different needs and quickly switch between them. Once you have your studio configured the way you want it, you can name and save the studio. When you exit out of the studio editor, you'll be back in the program editor with your new studio assigned to the program.